Now, it's been a tremendous privilege and a whole lot of fun to work alongside Dr. Claire Fraser for the past year, my first year as AAAS CEO. Claire is the director of the Institute for Genome Sciences and Dean's Endowed Professor of Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She has been a tremendous friend to and advocate for the AAAS over many years, and we are incredibly lucky to have her at the helm of our board during such a pivotal time for science and our world's dynamic ecosystems. I couldn't have asked for a better partner. And so, without further ado, for her AAAS presidential address, please join me in welcoming Dr. Claire Fraser.
I'm Claire Fraser, the president of AAAS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2021 virtual annual meeting. I'd like to thank the entire AAAS meetings team led by Nikki Maylett and the 2021 program committee for their hard work throughout the year. We've put together such a strong program in this very challenging time. You know, it seems to me that it's an understatement to say what a difference a year makes. 1 year ago, we were together in Seattle for the 2020 AAAS Annual Meeting. There was an obvious undercurrent at that meeting. All of us were paying very close attention to events that were unfolding in China, ones that would turn out to have enormous implications for global public health. On December 31st, 2019, the US CDC became aware of cases of a mysterious respiratory illness in Wuhan, China. In early January, a complete genome sequence obtained from one of the first cases in China was made publicly available, revealing the identity of this pathogen as a novel coronavirus. The first case in the US was reported on January 20th, 2020 in the state of Washington in a traveler who had recently returned home from Wuhan. On January 23rd, Chinese authorities shut down the city of Wuhan. The WHO had issued a statement indicating that human-to-human transmission of this novel virus was occurring. A preliminary R0 estimate of 1.4 to 2.5 was suggested, and the CDC sought an emergency use authorization from the FDA, enabling states to use its newly developed coronavirus test. On February 11th, as we began to assemble for our annual meeting in Seattle, the WHO announced the official name for the disease caused by this novel virus, COVID-19. And during our meeting, Bill Gates and several infectious disease experts signaled their deepening unease about the virus. Still, we had little comprehension of the tsunami that was about to hit. We'll return to the COVID-19 pandemic a bit later in this talk. The theme of this year's annual meeting is Understanding Dynamic Ecosystems. I chose this theme pre-COVID to focus on the complex networks that we study and those in which we live and work. To me, one of the most fascinating attributes of ecosystems is that of emergent properties, a term that's been used in science, systems theory, philosophy, urban studies, and even art. When we talk about emergent properties, we refer to those properties that are entirely unexpected based on our understanding of the individual components of any given ecosystem, the properties that arise from the collaborative functions across scales. Perhaps one of the best examples that we're all familiar with is the human brain. The idea that consciousness cannot be explained by the workings of single neurons, but instead requires the complex interconnections among all of them. Similarly, we can't predict everything about an individual based on having his or her genome sequence. Although we might be able to predict susceptibility to certain diseases based on genome data, gene-environment interactions are also critically important. The ecosystems concept works at several orders of magnitude, from the cellular to the multicellular to planet Earth. Under ideal conditions, ecosystems are balanced. The interactions between the different components that make up any given ecosystem contribute to its stability. But this doesn't in any way imply that ecosystems are static. In reality, ecosystems are constantly evolving because they're based on dynamic processes that are constantly changing. Ecosystems also evolve due to external or unforeseen events, whether they be natural or anthropogenic. Healthy ecosystems are also resilient. They're able to continue functioning and recover from a disturbance. But all ecosystems have a point of no return. And when they crash, there's usually no going back. I've actually been fascinated by the notion of ecosystems since I was very young. As a 5-year-old budding scientist, more than anything, I wanted my own colony of sea monkeys. Many of you are too young to even know what I'm referring to. Sea monkeys, Artemia selena, were offered for sale on the back of every comic book available in the 1960s. Artemia are cryptobiotic brine shrimp that survive desiccation, but they become metabolically active under favorable environmental conditions. I was enthralled with the idea of starting my own colony, an ecosystem in a fishbowl, where I could watch the sea monkeys raise families, build cities, engage in commerce, and where I could train them to perform tricks. Needless to say, after trying multiple times without success to revive my desiccated sea monkeys, I learned an important lesson about the need to move forward when experiments fail. My own research has evolved over the past 25 years to embrace, really to require, an ecosystem's perspective. In 1995, my colleagues and I were the first to apply the tools of the genomics revolution to sequence the first complete genome of a free-living organism, Haemophilus influenzae. This bacterium is a human pathogen, causing otitis media and more disseminated infections, primarily in children. This bacterium also has a very special place in the history of the field of molecular biology. It was from H. influenzae that Dr. Hamilton Smith from Johns Hopkins University isolated the first restriction endonucleases, an accomplishment for which he was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1978. One of the biggest surprises in the first complete genome sequence from Haemophilus was the relatively large number of the approximately 1,800 predicted open reading frames that encoded hypothetical proteins whose function was unknown. This quickly became a recurring theme as more bacterial and single-celled eukaryotic genome sequences were completed. And when the near-complete draft of the human genome sequence was completed in the early 2000s, it was immediately evident that the notion of one gene, one protein, one function was going to have to be revisited. We were confronted with the challenge of deciphering the complexity of human biology with only 20,000 or so genes, not even twice the number of protein coding genes found in the fruit fly Drosophila, and many times fewer genes than found in more complex polyploid plants. I focused a good part of my research over the past 2 decades on bacteria that cause disease in humans and animals. With a rather reductionist perspective, we early on assumed that comparative genomics would readily reveal what makes one strain of an infectious agent highly virulent and another one relatively harmless. While that approach worked in some instances, we came up short in terms of answers in other cases. What was missing in this framework was the fact that microbes cannot cause disease without a host. In a commentary published in 2014, Arturo Casadevall and Lisan Perovsky argued that instead of focusing on what microbes do or do not do, researchers should ask whether an interaction between a host and a microbe damages the host, And if so, how? In other words, a pathogen is only a pathogen in the right context, if it leads to disease in a permissive host. But even this framework is not enough. Microbes and hosts are variable and unpredictable, and they also interact in the context of the human microbiome, a vast and complex ecosystem of trillions of bacterial, archaeal, fungal, protozoal, and viral organisms that inhabit every surface and cavity of the human body. It's estimated that the total number of genes contributed by our microbial partners surpasses the genes in the human genome by 2 orders of magnitude. Our microbiomes are with us from birth until death. They're as unique as our fingerprints and influence our health in profound ways, being linked to a plethora of diseases and conditions, our moods and behaviors, and how we respond to drugs, just to name a few. As our understanding of the human microbiome increases, it's requiring us to think very differently about health and disease, not just from the perspective of individual organ systems, but instead from an appreciation that we as humans are a complex ecosystem embedded in a larger planetary ecosystem. We must acknowledge that we live on a planet of bacteria. By any measure, bacteria are and always have been the dominant forms of life on Earth. A 2016 NSF-funded study by Jay Lennon and Kenneth Losey of Indiana University estimated that there could be 1 trillion microbial species on Earth, belonging to the 2 oldest domains of the tree of life, the bacteria and the archaea. The study used microbial, plant, and animal data sets representing more than 5.6 microscopic and non-microscopic species from 35,000 locations across the world. Without question, microbial diversity is greater than we ever imagined. Bacteria and archaea are founding members of the biosphere, and without them, it wouldn't function as it does, and we wouldn't be here. And if we adjust our thinking to consider Earth as largely a planet of bacteria, we're still missing a big part of the picture. Where there are bacteria, there are also viruses, lots of viruses. Hendricks and colleagues estimated that there are 10 nonillion, that's 10 to the 31st power of viruses on Earth, enough to assign one to every star in the universe 100 million times over. Viruses are everywhere, in seawater, in the soil, in the air that we breathe. They hijack organisms from every branch of the tree of life. Most of the time, we manage to live in this virus-filled world relatively free of illness, because viruses are extremely particular about the cells that they infect. Only a tiny fraction of the viruses that surround us pose any threat to humans. But given the staggering number of viruses, it should then come as no surprise that SARS-CoV-2 emerged with pandemic potential. To many who study viral diversity and evolution, it was just a matter of time. A report from the National Academy of Sciences published in 2009 noted that at least 65% of recent infectious disease outbreaks had a zoonotic origin. In the past 25 years, we've had to confront almost 60 emerging or re-emerging infectious diseases, and a majority of these have zoonotic links. Most new infectious illnesses enter the human population the same way that SARS-CoV-2 did, as a disease that infects people by way of an animal, often a bat, rodent, or bird. Zoonotic disease emergence is a complex process. A series of external factors or drivers provide conditions that allow for a select pathogen to expand and adapt to a new niche. The drivers can be ecological, political, economic, and social forces operating at local, national, regional, and global levels. Regions where these factors are most densely aggregated, most highly prevalent, and where risk of a disease event are most intense can be considered zoonotic disease hotspots. Mammals and birds are thought to host about 1.7 million novel viruses, a statistic that has spurred scientists such as Dr. Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance to call for a survey of Earth's wildlife to identify other pathogens with pandemic potential, and an amendment in the wildlife protection law to manage wildlife trade as a public health and security issue. To make a successful transition from one species to another, a virus must clear a series of biological hurdles. It must exit one animal, come into contact with another, and establish an infection in the second host, what's known as a spillover event. Exact numbers are hard to estimate, but the vast majority of animal to human spillovers likely result in dead-end infections that never progress past the first individual. For a new virus to actually spark an outbreak, moreover a pandemic, many factors have to align. And it's increasingly clear that large-scale, often anthropogenic, environmental changes are among the most important drivers of emerging zoonoses. Changing demographics and unprecedented population movement, as well as increased global flow of people, goods, food animals, food products, and domesticated and wild animals, together with deforestation and reforestation and human and domestic animal encroachment on wildlife habitats, all move these unforeseen microbes. Rabies is an example of a zoonotic disease carried by animals that have become habituated to urban environments. Bats colonize buildings, skunks and raccoons scavenge human refuse, and in many countries, feral dogs in the streets are common and a major source of rabies infection. Lyme disease, transmitted by ticks, is another example of a zoonotic disease where humans are an unintended host in the life cycle of the Lyme bacteria. With so many potential zoonotic diseases, our proximity to wildlife puts us in harm's way. Increasing population density is clearly exacerbating this problem. World population has been growing continuously since the time of the Black Death. It began increasing rapidly in the Western world during the Industrial Revolution, but the most significant increases have come in the past 75 years due to rising standards of living, public health advances, and increases in agricultural productivity around the globe. The world's population continues to grow, albeit at a slower pace than at any time since 1950, when the population was only about 2 billion. From an estimated 7.8 billion people worldwide today, projections from the United Nations indicate that the global population could grow to 8.5 billion in 2030, 9.7 billion in 2050, and perhaps even as high as 11 billion in 2100, although there is some uncertainty in these projections. The world's increasing population has been linked to changes in land use patterns. This slide captures an image of a Brazilian rainforest over a 37-year period. Widespread deforestation around the world has been necessary to provide additional land for food production. The estimate is that agriculture is responsible for 80% of tropical rainforest loss. Since the 1960s, the production of food animals has also grown tremendously in response to population changes. Global milk production has doubled, meat production has tripled, and egg production has increased fourfold. And the environmental impacts of food and agriculture are substantial. Food production accounts for 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. 70% of fresh water withdrawals are for agriculture. 78% of global ocean and freshwater pollution is caused by agricultural practices. And 94% of the mammal biomass on Earth, excluding humans, is livestock. Livestock outweigh wild mammals by a factor of 15 to 1. Deforestation has been linked to a loss or change in biodiversity in important biomes around the globe. In a systematic review of almost 150 studies published in 2016, Mehring et al. Point out that this is a complex relationship, yet their analysis confirms the trend that demographic phenomena were mostly found to negatively influence biodiversity. Species declines threaten the essential services that natural ecosystems provide to people, which include functioning as carbon sinks. This widespread deforestation contributes to the climate crisis in another way. Trees capture enormous amounts of CO2, and when cut, they release all of their stored CO2 back into the atmosphere, perpetuating a vicious cycle in which land use changes, loss of biodiversity, and climate disruptions are inextricably linked. Peter Raven and Scott Miller noted in their editorial in Science in October of last year that the United Nations Summit on Biodiversity discussed reports that perhaps 1 million of the Earth's 8.5 million species of plants, animals, and other organisms are in grave danger of extinction. And probably as many as half of the organisms that existed 50 years ago are gone. Over a quarter of all tropical forests have been lost over the past 25 years. Taken together, these findings are consistent with the idea that we've entered the world's 6th major extinction event. Rapid changes in ecosystems challenge the ability of organisms to adapt quickly enough to survive. Though in some instances, climate change benefits a species by expanding its range, this often comes with detrimental effects on surrounding systems. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the impact of increasing temperatures above where we are today, which is illustrated by the gray bar in this slide, will be catastrophic in terms of the ability of many ecosystems, such as coral reefs, the Arctic, fisheries, to naturally adapt. And the impact on human systems, heat-related morbidity and mortality, tourism, and the ability to achieve sustainable development goals will also be significantly affected. Since the middle of the 20th century, global surface temperatures have risen approximately 1 degree Celsius. 3 of the past 5 years have been the warmest on record, and 2020 has unfortunately tied 2016 as being the warmest. Drought conditions have contributed to wildfires that are having an ever-increasing impact. In 2019, wildfires in both hemispheres destroyed more than 50 million acres of land. At the same time, ocean temperatures have been steadily increasing, and in 2020, there were a record 30 named Atlantic storms. Over the past 20 years, global carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels and industry have steadily increased, and these levels are forecast to continue this trajectory. At the turn of the 21st century, global emissions were roughly 23 billion metric tons, but by 2018, they had reached a record high of 36.4 billion metric tons. A first small observable deviation in this trend was in 2019, which was due to the economic downturn of the global recession, and a reduction in CO2 emissions of approximately 300 million metric tons. The emission reductions as a result of the COVID-19 shutdown represent an even larger effect, an unprecedented 1.6 billion metric tons of CO2 worldwide. And yet, while this seems like very encouraging news, the reduction in CO2 emissions seen during the past year amounted to only 5% of the total global output in greenhouse gases. And we've already seen a reversal in these numbers as human activities have resumed. This means that changes in our individual behaviors to reduce our carbon footprint, while important, will never be anywhere near sufficient to bring about the transformative changes that are required to tackle the climate crisis, without an immediate future focus on more holistic green policies that involve industry. Peter Neff, a climate scientist at the University of Minnesota, has said that to have a good chance of limiting global warming to the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, we essentially need a reduction in carbon emissions similar to that caused by the initial pandemic response every single year for the next decade and beyond. Clearly, that's not achievable. So what does all of this mean as we go forward? Why am I even talking about climate change when we're still overwhelmed with the ever-evolving COVID pandemic? The appearance of mutant strains of the virus that appear to be more transmissible, and the enormous public health challenge of trying to vaccinate the world's population so that life can return to normal. I think for me, it's because history has shown us that disasters can often be the time of biggest change. And as Winston Churchill said when he was working to form the United Nations at the end of World War II, never let a good crisis go to waste. Like the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis is a global problem that's going to require a concerted global effort to address. And to be clear, this will be much more difficult because there will be no way for countries or regions to protect themselves through local mitigation efforts. But I hope that a first lesson we have learned from the past year is that when necessary, we can in fact mobilize on a global scale to get things done. That said, we clearly saw that countries' responses to the pandemic varied considerably and ranged from swift, decisive, and forward-thinking to delayed, contradictory, and reactionary. And the outcomes were very different depending on the response. Countries that acted early and aggressively to close their borders, impose lockdowns, implement widespread testing and contact tracing, think Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, they fared far better in terms of the number of cases than most of the rest of the world. Many countries that had no prior experience with viral outbreaks acted only after there was evidence of local virus transmission and deaths, which was often too late to get ahead of the problem. In the case of COVID-19, Acting early often made the difference between a prolonged, full-scale lockdown and less dramatic measures. In the US, Pei et al. Estimated that starting social distancing 1 week earlier, on March 8th, could have prevented 600,000 cases and 32,000 deaths nationwide in the 2-month period from March to May. Had control measures been implemented 2 weeks earlier, an even more significant effect would have been achieved, a reduction of 1 million cases and 59,000 deaths in the US. These simulations are compelling with regard to the potential power of public health measures to flatten the curve. But I think it's clear that when it comes to climate change, we're operating on a very different timescale. Nonetheless, as with COVID-19, delays in responding will be very costly. Leading economists such as Lawrence Goulder of Stanford have argued that earlier action with regard to climate change might reduce mitigation costs significantly. But the reality is that the temporary economic shutdowns prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic are very different than the permanent transformations that will be required to move away from a fossil fuel-based economy to achieve a net zero emissions target. We must strategize now on the hard work to get all citizens on board with the changes that must be put in place to address the climate crisis. Part of this equation is understanding that the response to any perceived threat is in large part based on whether or not that threat is viewed as imminent. We've certainly seen this play out with COVID. In the field of psychology, availability is the ease with which a particular idea can be brought to mind. When people estimate how likely or how frequent an event is on the basis of its availability, they're using the availability heuristic, a term coined by Tversky and Kahneman in the 1970s. When an infrequent event can be brought easily and vividly to mind, this heuristic overestimates its likelihood. In other words, dramatic events that are highly publicized are more easily recalled. Therefore, they have a higher availability. On the other hand, common but mundane events are hard to bring to mind, so their likelihoods tend to be underestimated. This heuristic is one of the reasons why people are more easily swayed by a single vivid story than by a large body of statistical evidence. For example, after seeing several television programs on shark attacks, you start to think that such incidences are relatively common. When you go on vacation, you refuse to swim in the ocean because you believe the probability of a shark attack is high. In the case of climate change, the availability phenomenon has definitely stymied our efforts to communicate the urgency of the crisis. Greenhouse gases are invisible, and the relationship between global warming and its damage is nonlinear, making the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C almost impossible to comprehend. This presents real challenges for policymaking. An abstract threat with a long time horizon and the likelihood that certain segments of society will be impacted in significant ways. Unless and until a threat is viewed as being very close to home, far-reaching and effective policy decisions will be difficult. It seems to me that we can continue to try and close the psychological gap between the actual and perceived threat of climate change, but that's a monumental task, in my opinion. Instead, we can strategize on how to make new climate policies more appealing to the public, focusing not on specifics of emissions reductions, but instead focusing on the economic, social, and health benefits of new climate policies. And this is where each of us must play a more active role in engaging with the public in meaningful ways, getting out into our respective communities to work with civic leaders and local and state policymakers to address a range of issues that they deem to be relevant to them. As Dr. Holden Thorpe said in an editorial in Science last year, persuasive words are not enough. We as scientists have been losing the battle against a growing anti-science movement in this country for too long. Since 2004, the AAAS Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology has worked to provide scientists with communication resources and to facilitate dialogue between scientists and the public about the benefits, limits, and implications of science. But we need to redouble our efforts in this regard if we expect to make the progress that we need. In addition, I think that one of the most important lessons from the COVID pandemic is that it has disproportionately burdened the poor, from individuals that carry out essential service jobs and were not able to work from home, to those with inadequate access to health care, to low-income countries with inadequate public health infrastructure. The economic consequences of lockdowns around the world were felt far more acutely by these disadvantaged groups, all the while as debates ensued on how to balance virus containment with economic recovery. Regarding climate change mitigation, it's certain that disadvantaged segments of society will be disproportionately affected, both in terms of the environmental impacts of increasing temperatures and from the loss of jobs in the fossil fuel industry. This inequality must be recognized as part of the big picture now, and whatever our climate policies look like, this reality has to be taken into account as part of any final solution. As the COVID pandemic painfully demonstrated, we live in an interconnected world. On the plus side, we did ultimately benefit from international collaboration on sharing data and knowledge, even if some of the early international responses were limited. We must move away from denial and isolationism, and we must aspire to full international global cooperation. As we learned from COVID-19, accelerated and well-organized collaboration in global crises is essential. But countries must be aligned on their fundamental goals. Climate change poses an existential threat to our natural world and the fabric of society. And we must remember that this is not an us versus them situation. We must showcase successful bipartisan action whenever possible to reduce polarization. And we must continually work to address the systemic racism that exists in the sciences. As pointed out by Dr. Adia Harvey-Wingfield in her Science editorial last year, much of the problem is that racial biases not only occur in individuals, but they are also embedded in our institutions, what sociologists refer to as structural or systemic racism. Once primarily heard among social scientists, these terms have, in the past few months, become more mainstream. We will pay a substantial price if we don't tackle systemic racism head on now. Not only is it morally wrong, but we need to get everybody on board if we are to fully leverage science to tackle the biggest issues confronting our world today and in the future. For any future globally disruptive threats, and there will most certainly be others, science has a critical role to play, as it always has. Science will provide essential data that can ultimately be used in policy decisions. As we saw with COVID-19, data may be contradictory at times, and diverse views may emerge. And these will need to be refined and discussed as more data accumulate. What we know and what we don't yet know needs to be continually summarized and discussed in multiple, open, transparent venues. And we need to guard against the propagation of misinformation. We cannot vilify those who do not agree with us. Instead, we benefit by listening with open minds. Scientists, policymakers, and the public should all be at the table in such times of crisis. But we shouldn't wait for the next crisis to respond. We've seen many examples of the federal government jumping into action to quickly provide new funding when a novel threat appears. And we've seen the scientific community step up and contribute their time and expertise when needed to solve big challenges. Nowhere was this more evident than in the past year. Thousands of scientists in academia, industry, and government put their research on hold and repurposed their labs to work on solving the COVID-19 crisis. The fact that novel vaccines were developed, tested, approved, and administered in less than 1 year from the identification of SARS-CoV-2 is a testament to the transformative power of science to serve society. But work on these new vaccine platforms had been underway for more than 2 decades. Breakthroughs take time, and we need to do more. We need to fully embrace a science of preparedness now so that we're better ready to respond to any future threat. I'd like to wrap up with some words from David Attenborough from his 2020 documentary entitled A Life on Our Planet. He said, "There are many differences between humans and the rest of the species on Earth. But one that has been expressed is that we alone are able to imagine the future. Our future doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. There's a chance for us to make amends, to complete our journey of development, manage our impact, and once again become a species in balance with nature. All we need is the will to do so. We have the opportunity to create the perfect home for ourselves and restore the rich, healthy, and wonderful world that we inherited. Just imagine that." Indeed, just imagine that. It is my fervent hope that we will emerge from this pandemic with a new appreciation of the impact that we as a species have had on our planet, the consequences of our actions, both good and bad, our capacity for change, and the need for immediate and transformative action. We know that we must all fully embrace science as part of the solution to a brighter future. One of the strengths of AAAS is its multidisciplinary focus and its commitment to harness the power of science and engineering to the benefit of society. Complex problems require multidisciplinary solutions. I'm confident that AAAS will play a leading role in the important conversations that will be required to bring about meaningful change in the ecosystems in which we live, and those that support our scientific endeavors. I challenge each of you listening to be inspired to do more and be part of the solution. Thank you.